Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Asian Impact webinar, which serves as a launch event for the inaugural issue of ADB's Asia Pacific Climate Report. I'm Abdul Abiad, Director of Macroeconomic Research here at ADB, and I'll be your moderator this morning. So the full report can be found on ADB's website, and a link to the report will be or has been posted in the chat. And I'd like to open the webinar by inviting Toru Kubo, Senior Director in ADB's Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, to provide some opening remarks. Toru?
Great, thank you, Abdul. Good morning to all. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of ADB's inaugural Asia Pacific Climate Report, titled Catalyzing Finance and Policy Solutions. We are at a very critical juncture in addressing the defining challenge of our generation, climate change. Scientists warned us multiple decades ago, and we are now experiencing its devastating impacts. Extreme heat, storms, floods, droughts, rising sea levels, wreaking havoc on human lives and economies globally. Even if we fully implement the current pledges in the nationally determined contributions, we are on a trajectory to at least 2.4 degrees Celsius global average warming by the end of the century. Now, I just mentioned global average. On land, where most of us live, temperature rise is higher. Earlier this year, here in Manila, the heat index reached 48 degrees. And just a few weeks later, the actual temperature exceeded 50 degrees in Delhi. Similar conditions persisted across parts of Central, South, and Southeast Asia. You will hear more shortly from the research team, but we could be heading for 4 to 8 degrees warming across the inhabited parts of Asia and the Pacific within the century. Now, given that warmer air of 1 degree Celsius can hold roughly 7% more water, that is approximately 30 to 50% more moisture in the atmosphere that comes crashing down when it hits cold air masses. Our cities, the rivers, the drainage systems, the critical infrastructure for power, transport, water, food production systems, buildings and homes are not designed to cope with such extreme heat and sudden volumes of water. I'm sure many of you have heard the term climate proofing. It's sad to say that the days of thinking about how to climate proof specific pieces of infrastructure are over. The climate impacts that we are locked into and will further intensify are already beyond piecemeal measures. We must shift to a systems approach to address climate and disaster resilience, enhance analysis of climate and disaster risks, and integrating such risks into development planning and public financial management are crucial steps forward. I mentioned about accelerating climate change. The Asia-Pacific region generates about half of global greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists warn us that if we exceed 1.5 to 2 degrees average warming, we run increasing risks of triggering tipping points, such as ice cap loss, permafrost melt and methane release, forest dieback, major changes in ocean circulation. I'm sure you've heard of tipping points, but to visualize, that's like a very large ship, vessel, gradually tilting, and you try to hang on, and you wait it out. But at a certain point, it just tips over, and you cannot flip it back. That is a runaway climate change scenario. Now, this scenario is not yet fully understood, but what science informs us is devastating. And let's be clear, none of our countries and societies will be able to adequately cope with a runaway climate change scenario. The latest IPCC assessment report said we have 500 gigatons of carbon budget left to have a 50% chance of staying within 1.5 degrees and 90% chance for 2 degrees. That budget was back in 2020, and we are using up that budget by 40 gigatons per year, roughly. So we have 10 years left. We are running out of time to stop the ship from flipping over. Now, there's a massive financing gap for both adaptation and mitigation. You will hear the numbers shortly from the team. We must mobilize the vast amounts of private capital into climate solutions, or it will become too late. Policy and regulatory reforms are key. Governments have a critical role to play by creating the right policy environments and driving financial sector reforms. For mitigation, creating a price signal through policy alignment is a game changer. Many say that climate change is the biggest market failure in the history of markets. There's no global price for emitting greenhouse gases into atmosphere, even though there are significant damages across nations and generations. We must look seriously and urgently at carbon pricing to redirect and unleash private investment flow. In both adaptation and mitigation, there are many opportunities to enhance energy and food security, for example, higher level of resilience to various shocks, not just climate shocks, and create jobs for the future. ADB is here to support our developing member country clients. Climate change threatens to reverse development gains, deteriorate livelihoods, threaten food security, trigger displacement, and worsen poverty. Some used to characterize development and climate action as a trade-off. Now it's clear that no development is sustainable without addressing climate challenges. It is fundamental to our development mandate. So our president, who we affectionately call President Masa, and our new operating model endorsed by the board set us on a course to make a decisive shift to become the region's climate bank. It's not a strengthening of climate operations. It's a bank-wide shift. It's about every part of ADB contributing to climate solutions. We crystallized this in our climate change action plan approved last year, which includes concrete actions with clear responsibilities and timelines. For example, our finance sector office is leading the charge on mobilizing climate finance through capital markets. Our Office of Market Development and Public-Private Partnerships is leading on carbon market development. Our procurement department is leading the way on green procurement. And this new climate report series is led by our premier research team, the Economic Research and Development Impact Department, closely working with the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department. ADB aims to marry analytical and operational capacity with climate leadership and expertise. This report is not intended to be comprehensive in its coverage of climate change issues, nor is it meant to be a one-off. ADB is committed to directing a major part of its research and knowledge to the challenges presented by climate change, and we will be adding to this report with regular editions going forward. Let me conclude by underlining that ADB's intention with the Asia-Pacific Climate Report is to provide policymakers with updated analysis, policy ideas, and evidence of good practice to support their efforts in tackling climate change. We look forward to working closely with all of our stakeholders to continue to drive forward policy-relevant research. Thank you, and let me hand over to Yi Jiang, who is our overall lead for the report, and he will take you through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toru. Good morning, everyone. My name is Yi Jiang. I'm a principal economist in the Economic Research and Development Impact Department of Asian Development Bank. I'm honored to present this report today on behalf of the team. Now let me share my screen. The inaugural issue of Asia-Pacific Climate Report consists of 5 chapters. The first chapter provides an overview and the scene setting. The rest chapters discuss impacts and the costs of climate change, adaptation, mobilizing finance, and the carbon pricing, respectively. Since 2000, the emissions intensity of the region's economies has decreased by over 50%. However, Asia and the Pacific currently still contribute about half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The 2015 Paris Agreement provided a new momentum to climate action, but 9 years later, interventions have been insufficient to reverse emission trends. The chart on the left focuses on Asia and the Pacific. The black and the blue lines reveal that neither current policies or nationally determined contributions are sufficient for achieving the Paris Agreement goals and are not aligned with net zero pledges. Sorry. Sorry about that. As more ambitious mitigation action is needed, Asia and the Pacific can play a pivotal role in the global transition to net zero. Economies in developing Asia are still relatively carbon intensive, presenting significant opportunities for emission reduction. As the right-hand side chart shows, developing Asia has deployed more renewable energy capacity than any other region in the world. As this capacity has expanded, both installation and energy generation costs have decreased rapidly. The trend is expected to continue. For this report, we conducted an online survey earlier this year on climate change and policy perception in 14 economies in Asia, receiving more than 13,000 responses. Perceptions, concerns, and the level of support differed across economies and provide interesting insights for contextual policy action. Here are some highlights. 91% of respondents overall viewed climate change as a serious problem, and 84% said that they or their families were already experiencing its impacts or expected to within the next decade. The subregions of South Asia and Southeast Asia showed the highest concern. Respondents were most concerned about severe heat waves, floods, and unpredictable weather, highlighting the need for adaptation strategies to address these challenges. A small majority supported more ambitious climate actions, including laws and regulations to limit emission. For example, emission standards for buildings and appliances, investments in low emission and resilient infrastructure, such as renewable energy, public transport, and the implementation of a carbon tax. Most believed these policies would have a positive effect on their households in the long term. While there is support for climate measures, concerns about their effectiveness in combating climate change, the potential costs and the disruptions, and the issues related to their design and implementation remain. This report discusses topics relating to adaptation, finance, and mitigation that are at the forefront of both government and public attention. The second chapter gives us an understanding of what climate change could mean and how much is at stake for the Asia and the Pacific region. Under conventional modeling, nationally determined contributions is projected to only reduce warming from 3 degrees to 2.4 degrees. Moreover, when taking into account feedback effects such as rising methane emissions due to increases in temperature and rainfall, warming may go much faster. A high-end emission scenario studied in this chapter implies 4.5 degrees warming of the globe. However, local and seasonal temperature changes in much of the inhabited land areas of Asia will exceed the global average. Heat waves will increase dramatically with number of days above 35 degrees, doubling across the region by the end of the century. We'll see more concentrated and variable rainfall with peak daily precipitation rising by 50% in the Pacific, 40% in South Asia, and 30% in East and Southeast Asia. The more concentrated the precipitation will go along with more drought, because as temperatures become hotter, there's more evaporation and evapotranspiration. Sea level rise would be about 80 centimeters globally. But when we consider relative sea level rise along with land subsidence, it can actually be much higher in many parts of developing Asia. When we used a new model that captures a lot of more details of the coast of developing Asia and the distribution of assets along the coast, we find enormous vulnerability and potential losses from the effects of sea level rise, combined with storm surge. By 2070, under a high-end emission scenario, we would have trillions of dollars of damage and tons of millions of people affected annually. River-based flooding could add hundreds of billions of dollars to the loss in industrial and commercial areas annually, principally in South Asia. Agriculture would benefit from climate change through something called CO2 fertilization. Meanwhile, agriculture suffers from more flooding, drought, salinity, etc. Considering both pathways, we find very high production losses for wheat, particularly in South Asia, for maize across much of Asia, and a more mixed picture for rice because it is not as directly affected by drought. In addition, we estimated a 20 to 30% decline in labor productivity by 2070, particularly for workers in tropical and subtropical climates and in high exposure sectors, which normally contain many of the poor. There are many other impacts that are very important to consider. Energy consumption will increase for cooling in hotter temperatures. Forest production falls significantly due to changes in climate, pests, fires, etc. Fisheries catch declines as ocean warms and becomes acidified. Heat-related mortality will triple and morbidity will be heightened. Social and human capital will also be lost, especially for females, due to increased violence and conflict. Learning outcomes will decline under more heat waves. We developed a computable general equilibrium model that accounts for most of these channels of loss, except for social capital and health. To quantify the costs of climate change, the key result is that 17% of GDP in developing Asia could be lost due to climate change by 2070. The chart on the right-hand side shows GDP loss by different channels for subregions and the largest DMCs. The primary channel of loss is sea level rise, followed by labor productivity losses and flooding. Among sectors, agriculture is most directly affected. The nature of the shocks and where they occur imply that the lowest income countries and the populations are most vulnerable. If we took this result out to year 2100, as we often do, it would imply about 40% potential GDP loss under the high-end emission scenario, which is dramatically more than we quantified before. Chapter 3 begins by unpacking how adaptation policy can be approached and providing a framework for adaptation decision-making. The chapter then reviews adaptation needs by sector and system. Adaptation is extremely urgent because the impacts are enormous, but there's significant uncertainty about emissions, climate, impacts, and the human society in the future. With all these sources of uncertainty, adaptation has to be continually updated and revised with new understanding and new evidence accumulating. At the same time, adaptation must involve many kinds of responses in every sector. As shown in the left-hand side chart, there are many ways of thinking about adaptation. As we increasingly feel the impacts of climate change and gain a deeper understanding of it, we have to be prepared to move to the right side of the framework from the left, where we have to look at much more dramatic types of transformational responses that are systemic and strategic. We may be addressing things that are purely motivated by adaptation, rather than mixed with a lot of development and less adaptation. We need to progress beyond just the no-regret options, which have clear benefits for other purposes, and small incremental climate-proofing investments to pave the way for transformational action. The chapter spends a lot of time looking at adaptation needs across different sectors and lays out many things that can be done. According to model-based estimation, coast protection is the #1 area of investment needed, especially in vulnerable regions like the Pacific. After that, there's also investment in infrastructure, rising energy demand, river-based flooding, agriculture, and fisheries. Almost every sector needs a combination of soft solutions, such as capacity improvement, policy reforms, with hard investments in infrastructure or natural-based solutions. The estimated investment needs on an annual basis range between $102 billion to $431 billion for the region until 2030. However, the actual flow is estimated to be only about $34 billion. It is essential to find ways to bridge this significant financing gap. However, adaptation is inherently more difficult to finance than mitigation. Domestic finance becomes important. So far, the private sector has not contributed much. Less than 1% of adaptation finance flows in the region. We have to get much more creative, leveraging innovative financial instruments, public-private partnership, etc. There's a need for much stronger responses to contain the major risks outlined in the previous chapter. Given the uncertainty surrounding climate change, it is crucial to continuously reassess potential impacts and risks such that policy responses remain aligned with the evolving climate landscape. Additionally, improving low climate risks are communicated can help raise awareness and promote proactive action among stakeholders. Adaptation measures need to be fully integrated into national development and expenditure planning. By using science-based criteria, governments can better prioritize and sequence adaptation projects, ensuring that resources are allocated where they will have the greatest impact. Strengthening market mechanisms can improve the efficiency of adaptation efforts, driving innovation and the private sector involvement in climate resilience. Overcoming finance limitations is critical to enabling widespread adaptation to climate change. Increasing access to concessionary finance, low-cost long-term funding can help vulnerable countries and the communities implement necessary adaptation measures. Moreover, by diversifying sources of finance and offering a broader range of financial products, the adaptation finance landscape can be expanded to ensure more sustained and flexible funding for long-term resilience efforts. Chapter 4 focuses on how to better mobilize private capital for climate mitigation and adaptation. Recent advances in climate policies, financial markets development, and public resources have formed both direct and non-direct financial drivers to mobilize private climate capital. We investigate remaining impediments to private climate capital in 3 major areas. First, uncertain and misaligned climate policies hinder private climate capital. Uncertainty in climate policies will pose risk perceptions of private investors and delay climate investments. The right-hand side chart shows new evidence that greater climate policy certainty proxied by climate law adoption boost investments in sustainable assets in the long run. In addition, misalignment among policies would weaken incentives to private investors. One typical example is the implementation of clean energy subsidies and carbon pricing, together with fossil fuel subsidies. To improve, aligned and holistic climate policy packages can better drive private climate capital. Government can reduce climate policy uncertainty by sending clear signals, for example, via adopting a comprehensive policy package, which is not just more policies, but a mix of coherent pricing and non-pricing measures. As shown in the right-hand side chart, advanced economies in the top rows generally adopt a more comprehensive policy packages compared to developing Asian economies in the lower section. Moreover, governments can align policies and adopt holistic policy packages by combining supportive infrastructure development with comprehensive systemic reforms. This strategy strengthens incentive for the private sector to engage. Another big constraint is lacking a climate-enabling financial market. In developing Asia, climate disclosure is adopted by large public listed companies, while small companies companies, especially SMEs, lack resources and capacity to do so. The sustainable finance market still accounts for a small fraction of the conventional financial market. Multiple sustainable finance taxonomies may raise transaction costs and disrupt financial intermediation, delaying international capital flows. Regulators in developing Asia can green the financial system with monetary and regulatory instruments to mainstream climate risk pricing. Government shall accelerate adoption of climate disclosure standards, such as ISSB, by equipping smaller companies with needed resources and capacity. Regulators can also enable more investments in transition projects by developing transition taxonomy and encouraging institutions to develop credible transition plans or pathways. Last but not least, various barriers hinder private climate capital. Some climate projects face sector-specific challenges. For example, renewable energy and the electric vehicle rely on a few critical minerals, such as copper and rare earths, which face supply challenges like insufficient mining capacity and the concentration of supplying economies. Commercial viability of climate projects is challenged by lack of insurance, high upfront costs, relatively long payback horizons, high preparation costs, and the related social environmental risks, as well as the macro risks such as political, currency, regulatory, and the transfer risks. Governments can use public measures to help address them. For example, adopting innovative de-risking instruments to attract private investors with different risk-return preferences and mandates. Government can also make structural changes to markets like purchase mandates, tackling entry barriers and early-stage challenges, and overcoming market rigidity such as long-term power purchase agreement. Chapter 5 focuses on climate pricing policies, which are considered critical in reducing carbon emissions cost effectively. Before we talk about imposing a positive carbon price, we first cover how fossil fuel subsidies act as negative carbon pricing, encouraging the use of high carbon energy sources by reducing prices and reinforcing fossil fuel dependence. In 2022, developing Asia provided $600 billion in financial support for fossil fuel, with $440 billion in consumption subsidies for electricity and petroleum, and the rest in capital investments and international finance. Rationalizing and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies has been slow in the region. Governments are urged to develop clear reform plans to realign public resources with climate goals. Targeted measures like direct cash transfers are more effective for supporting vulnerable groups during climate crisis. Carbon tax and the ETS are two main carbon pricing policy instruments. In the region, only Japan and Singapore have implemented national carbon taxes. 6 national ETS have been implemented in Australia, New Zealand, Kazakhstan, China, Korea, and Indonesia, respectively. This chapter discusses various design and implementation issues of the two instruments and provide policy recommendations to improve or adopt them. In the design of carbon tax policies, tax rate coverage and the use of revenue are crucial factors. While some advocate for a tax aligned with the social cost of carbon, currently estimated at about $200 per ton, most countries set lower rates for political feasibility. The easiest method for enforcing a carbon tax is to tax fossil fuels upstream. It has considerable advantages for lower and middle-income economies in the region, as these countries usually have large informal sectors and limited enforcement capacity. Economic reasoning suggests that the revenue from carbon taxation should be redirected to the highest value public uses. Carbon tax is not necessarily regressive. Proper revenue use, such as rebates or targeted transfers, can offset the regressive impacts, ensuring that low-income households are protected. Uncertainty in emission reductions could be addressed through adjustment mechanisms, which adjust tax rate based on the gap between actual emissions and the target path. Current evidence does not support that carbon pricing, at least at a low level, might negatively affect growth or cause significant inflation. On employment, a carbon tax could result in job shifting, but have limited effect on the overall employment. Political and public acceptance remain the most formidable challenge for wider adoption of carbon taxes. Countries are more likely to adopt carbon taxes if these are gradually phased in, announced with clear communication, and coupled with measures to protect affected industries and households. Based on comprehensive review and assessment of the main ETS in the region, we draw some lessons. First, the benefits and challenge of efficiency-based systems should be closely observed. Second, institutional and regulatory frameworks, including monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, are pivotal to the smooth operation of an ETS. Third, heavily regulated power sectors could be improved in a way to allow carbon price pass-through to enhance the effectiveness of ETS. Last but not least, to add flexibility, countries can also allow for offset use in an ETS. There are potentially significant benefits of linking ETS across countries. Given the complexity, however, each country could prioritize further development of domestic market in the near term. Meanwhile, we make some policy suggestions regarding how to facilitate the linking process in the medium to long term. The chapter also provides an up-to-date analysis of the international carbon markets. Under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, countries can trade emission reductions through internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, which help mobilize carbon finance for low-carbon technologies. Development of international carbon markets presents opportunities and challenges for Asia and the Pacific. The Asia and the Pacific region have extensive experience in carbon market mechanisms. Developing economies can use international carbon markets to access climate finance, as well as meet domestic climate goals. However, the region has work to do in scaling up involvement in international carbon markets, alongside enhancing institutional capacity and technical readiness to participate in international carbon markets. An important first step for many countries is to develop holistic national carbon market strategies. The nationally determined commitment accounting aspect of Article 6 is critical to effective market integration. Nature-based solutions face a significant financing gap despite considerable potentials in mitigation and adaptation. The carbon market can help to address the future. The future of nature-based solutions in international carbon markets appears complex yet promising. So this concludes my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Yi, for that overview of the report's findings and messages. It provides a great jump-off point for our discussion. Let me start off with some initial questions for the panel, and then I see a lot of questions already in the Q&A, which I'll fold into my initial questions if I can, and then we'll definitely leave enough time for audience Q&A because we go until 11:15 a.m. Manila time. So, David, let me start with you because Yi's presentation gave us a quick look at possible climate impacts. Could you elaborate a bit more about what drives potential economic losses from climate change and how losses might evolve over time? It actually relates to one of the questions in the chat from Beatrice Cruz about, in her case, the question specifically about the Philippines. What specific drivers would result in the 18% GDP loss due to climate change under a high emission scenario? Over to you, David.
Okay, thanks for the great question. Please, let's advance to the next slide. I have a couple of slides just to help explain. We anticipated some of these questions in this interest, which is great to see. So there was also a question about the near-term impact of climate change I saw posed by one of the audience members. So first, let me caveat when we do this kind of modeling, we're starting from a representation of a recent economy. So in this case, the computable general equilibrium model is the economy of 2017. And we're looking at basically impacts from a baseline of 2020. So the impacts look small in the beginning, but there are actually larger impacts than this that have occurred, but we don't know really the counterfactual of what things would have looked like historically without climate change and where we would be with today's economy. So we're starting from today and looking forward in terms of the impacts of additional climate change from today. So the initial numbers may look a little bit small. So, we show here, for example, in a decade, a GDP loss of around 3%. The actual full GDP loss from climate change from pre-industrial times is more than this, but it does progress faster over time. So we're only really beginning to feel the impacts that we will face in the future. And what drives impact changes over time. So initially, a lot of the impact comes from effects on labor productivity, from higher heat waves, from more energy demand for cooling during those heat waves. Over time, things like sea level rise progress, and they become a much larger share of impacts. And we start to feel more of the impacts in natural resource-based sectors like agriculture, fisheries, and forestry, because they get hit much more later in the century than what we see now. So this composition changes, but we also see that over time, the rate of increase of losses is actually increasing. Let's go on to the next slide because I want to make a point also about this. So if we take that increasing rate of losses, if we think about that, what we've done is we've extended the results based on climate change itself. It's not based on time, but based on climate change itself. We've extended results out to 2100. And what you see is a loss of 41% of GDP that could happen based on the fact that these processes that drive loss are not all linear with respect to time. Some of them are increasing over time, like sea level rise. And that means that the future economy is extremely vulnerable. Our vulnerabilities just keep rising over time. And that when we look at 41% loss in particular economies like Bangladesh, for example, as a vulnerable economy, the loss is catastrophic. 41% is for the region as a whole. And that's accounting for the fact that also we have higher income economies like the People's Republic of China that has lower than average losses among the regions. So that brings down the regional number. So there are specific vulnerable economies that have a lot to lose. And a lot of this really, we can avoid most of it if we really act quickly to reduce emissions. But we also did an exercise and we find we can't avoid all of it. Even if we met Paris Agreement objectives, we still find 11% GDP loss. So that's only a quarter of a high-end emission scenario, but it's still very important, and it's important in vulnerable economies because those losses could be 25% for an economy like Bangladesh. And that means it's really critical to address adaptation. Even as we address mitigation, we still won't solve everything. Adaptation remains important no matter what mitigation policy we have in the future. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. And thanks for taking that, noticing that question on near-term impacts and addressing it already. On the question on the Philippines, I guess, we'll try to get to it later. Yeah, go ahead.
I can just answer very quickly. So on the Philippines, you see a little bit of a similar pattern. The dominant, about half of losses come from sea level rise. And then a larger share than at the regional average would come from natural resource-based sectors. So agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and these sources. So it differs a little bit from the overall regional picture. If you want to see the very precise composition, it's in an appendix to chapter 2. For those here, you can look and see the exact breakdown and over time. Thank you.
Good. And Beatrice, in any case, you now know that you can reach out to David if you have further questions on that, again, to elaborate on it. So thanks very much, David. So this whole point about even in the near term, you're already seeing impacts. I mean, it was very evident in the climate change survey that Yi presented, and I'd like to call on Madhavi maybe to elaborate a bit more. So, can you elaborate on the survey's objectives, first of all, and findings? And based on those findings, what should governments do?
Thank you, Abdul. Yeah, just to remind the audience, for this report, ADB conducted an online survey this year of about 13,500 residents across 40 nation economies. So the objective was to understand first people's perception about climate change, second, their awareness of government action, third, their preferences for adaptation and resilience investments, and fourth, what are some factors influencing public support for climate policies? And indeed, as the presentation highlighted, a huge majority of respondents identified climate change as a serious problem and also feel their effects. Concerns were particularly high regarding heat waves, floods, and unpredictable weather, which also align with scientists' predictions, as Toru mentioned earlier. However, an important insight we got is that awareness of government policies and actions was somewhat limited and varied significantly across the region. See, the bottom line is that given that the region accounts for nearly 50% of global emissions, meeting Paris Agreement goals hinges on Asia's rapid decarbonization. And as policymakers prepare to accelerate climate action, garnering public support and addressing any skepticism is critical. So the analysis showed that support for climate policies and adoption of climate-friendly behaviors depended on what individuals' perceptions are of how climate change directly impacts them, also their awareness of climate policies, as I mentioned, and thirdly, demographic characteristics like age, education level, income, as well as individuals' lifestyle, for example, whether they use public transport or how they consume news, etc. So to circle back to your question, based on the survey findings, a key strategy is to close the awareness gaps related to climate change, its impacts, and the solutions. So one way is tailored communication and increased transparency in policy design, which is essential. My last point is that it is very important to consider local contexts and diverse demographics when framing policies and also communicating about them. This survey is a valuable starting point for these efforts and can be a useful way to explore further. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Madhavi. Actually, so your answer gets at one of the questions in the Q&A from Chatya Nantam, which was basically asking, he noted that perceptions of climate change and its impact were high, but support policies are quite low. And one of the things you've stressed is, one, the importance of communicating, because the survey actually informs about where the support is, and it varies by demographic groups based on whether they take public transport or not and things like that. So I invite all the audience to read it and the background paper on that, because there are many interesting insights. But one of those is that it varies by country, as Madhavi noted. The support is sometimes in older cohorts, but in other countries in younger cohorts, etc. So thanks for that, Madhavi. Still staying on the issue of adaptation, on again the fact that we have these big impacts. Adaptation, we know, will be important to reduce the losses from even these near-term impacts. But it was clear from Yi's presentation, he talked about the investment needs being large, I think between 100 to 400 billion per year, but the current financing for adaptation was just 34 billion, so a tiny fraction of what's needed. And he also mentioned that private finance for adaptation is just 1% of the total. So I want to turn to Grace. Why is it hard? Why is it so hard to mobilize private capital for adaptation investments? And I think there were some related questions in the chat on that. So feel free to answer those if you can fold it into your intervention. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Abdul. Yes, indeed, it's relatively hard for private sector to participate in adaptation investments. First of all, it's really because adaptation projects often involves uncertainty outcomes in the future due to the climate change. And this is very hard to price because private sector needs to price the outcomes of unmaterialized climate risks to the assets in the future. And then this is highly depends on the transition pathways and then how the climate change might materialize. So it's very hard and it brings them a lot of uncertainty. And then at the same time, adaptation projects tends to have a relatively longer investment horizon compared to mitigation. Then this add one extra layer of risks to private investors. And at the same time, unlike many mitigation projects, which has a relatively clearly defined business model, and then sets the cash flows, revenue streams to price, many adaptation projects, they tends to be more like infrastructure and even public good type of products. And then it is very hard for private sector to generate clear revenues out of such assets, and making it difficult for private sector to participate. And then also in line with the nature of public goods, there is also lack of standardized assessment metrics for those adaptation projects, which also prevent private sector to participate because they don't have a ready way to assess them. And then also it's very hard for them to justify to their donors and then also investors. So that's roughly why it's more difficult for private sector to directly participate in adaptation projects. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. So I mean, Dennis Bautista had this question about that was precisely about the investment gaps. There was a question about, are there per country estimates in folded into Dennis's question? Is that in the report, Grace?
It is not in the report, but there are some estimates from other ADB products and then our previous reports last year. So there are some country-specific investments. Yeah.
Sounds good. Dennis, feel free to reach out to Grace and she can point you to where we can find that. Also in Dennis's question, the last part of Dennis's question, so what's the role of ADB in filling this huge gap? And so maybe I'd like to invite Declan to take that. And Declan, while you're answering that, I mean, one, as Toru mentioned, ADB put out its climate change action plan recently. And so maybe you can talk about how this current report informs or, what implication it has for ADB's action plan. And obviously that part of that is on the financing side, but there's other actions as well. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Abdul. And first of all, it's just a great pleasure to be here and to be part of this report and all the work that's gone in. And it's great as well to see the questions that are coming through. But maybe, Abdul, I'll start just with the climate change action plan side of that question. And just to say, well, the first thing to say is that preparing this report was actually one of the actions in the climate change action plan. So and that's a nice little just sort of link back. But to your question, I think there are two sides or two ways to think about this question. So on the one hand, if we take the climate change action plan, as was said earlier, it was launched last year, and the idea with the action plan really was to chart a path for ADB to deliver accelerated climate action and help its member countries attain ambitious climate outcomes. The action plan is meant to be iterative. In other words, what we didn't want to do is we didn't want to set down a rigid plan in place from 2023 to 2030 in an area where the challenge, climate change, and the responses to that challenge are evolving all the time. So as such, the action plan is deliberately set up to allow ADB to accommodate new ideas and policy solutions, including, of course, the learning that comes from research and knowledge. So in a sense, this report fits perfectly into that slipstream, and so does some of the future iterations of the report. On the other hand, if you take the report itself, there's lots of ways that it's already providing operationally relevant information, and that really feeds into the action plan. So if you take the framing of the action plan, ADB recognizes the need to provide a full cycle of support to our member countries. So covering upstream, midstream and downstream support. So if you then look at what Yi and others have talked about, and for those who have the time to sort of jump into the report, it speaks to all of this. So it's targeted, first of all, at policymakers. So it really fits neatly into that upstream space. So helping member countries to identify strong climate policies that can play an important role. And as I said, Yi's presentation touched on some of those recommendations, but it's not limited to the upstream contributions. Like if you take a look at some of the recommendations in specific chapters, so for example, the adaptation chapter, which we've touched on, or the climate finance chapter, that's already getting into the core parts of national budgets and planning processes. So, you know, one recommendation is around national adaptation plans and making sure that they're really integrated into medium-term development plans and expenditure frameworks. Or the recommendation in Grace's chapter for policymakers to help develop climate-oriented financial systems. This is really, you know, the core parts of what we see as the midstream and what is we identified as the midstream in the Climate Change Action Plan. But it also doesn't stop there. And I suppose I go back to Toru's point at the very start. What we're trying to do with all of our work on climate change is to make sure that every part of ADB sees climate change as their role and as their objective front and center. And so what we've got here as well is we've got a collaboration primarily of two departments, the Economic Research and Development Impact Department and our Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, but of course lots of expertise coming from others. But both of these departments play a critical role in supporting operations. And so this then provides an ideal channel for the idea that this report and future editions, the idea, it's an ideal channel to take these ideas and make sure that that filters down into operational work. So for me, I see a really, really positive and sort of reinforcing link between what this report is trying to do and what the Climate Change Action Plan is doing. Do you want me as well, Abdul, to touch briefly on then just Dennis's question about what ADB is doing to fill the climate? Okay, so
yes, please do.
So I'd say we're doing it in two ways, right? So first of all, what are we doing ourselves with our own resources, right? So ADB, with our own resources, we have a commitment to deliver more than 100 billion in cumulative climate finance between 2019 and 2030. And 34 billion of that is dedicated for climate adaptation and resilience. We also have in there an intention for climate finance to reach 50% of the total committed financing volume by 2030. Within that, that also includes private sector. So private sector operations are expected to contribute 12 billion. And that 12 billion as well is also expected to crowd in an additional 18 to 30 billion in climate finance. So first of all, it's thinking about what can we do? What can we also then do to leverage other resources in? The 100 billion, of course, people will go, but that's not going to fill that gap that we've been talking about. So in addition to that, we are looking at how we go beyond what we're doing ourselves so that we're finding ways to use our capacity and willingness to take risks to leverage in further resources. So some of this is the core, the hard work we do alongside ministries of finance and central banks to put climate change at the center of public and private sector finance and financial systems. So we're driving this with our policy-based instruments and hoping that and looking to help countries unlock climate finance at scale. But also we're doing lots of other initiatives that are specifically looking at mobilizing climate finance in certain spaces. So if you look at, for example, the innovative financing for climate in Asia and the Pacific, the IFCAP facility, that is going to unlock 11 billion in capital for climate action. If you look at the energy transition mechanism, that's trying to draw in concessional and commercial capital to incentivize the early retirement or repurposing of coal-fired power plants, but also incentivizing new investments in clean energy, grid modernization, and energy storage. We have work that we're doing on green and blue bond frameworks, which is really then intending to get behind developing member countries and help them raise additional capital. I'll stop there because I know you want to bring other people in, but there's a lot going on and others may have examples that they want to bring in and add as well. Back over to you, Abdul.
Great. So again, I'd like to invite the audience for people who want to know more about what ADB is doing on the climate change front. Again, you can take a look at the Climate Change Action Plan. Feel free to reach out to Declan or to Toru or others if you, in that regard. So I see there were some questions in the chat which were country specific. There's one from Naransetseg on Mongolia, and the second question of Beatrice earlier was on the Philippines policies. Those really aren't in the report, so let's not take them here. There are many other questions that are focused and related to the report's contents. We will pass them on to our country offices, so that to give them a chance to respond to you directly, because thanks for registering so that we can reach out to you directly. So I will move on now to, okay, there are a couple of questions from Pranav and then from Bold on which relate to, okay, in Pranav's case, it's about financial industries and how to model climate risk for reporting purposes, especially when climate risk is multidimensional. And then Bold also had the question, Grace, about what can authorities do to mitigate risks associated with greenwashing, and how can we support that? Are those questions you can take? I don't know if combined or separately.
Okay, thanks,
Yeah,
Abdul.
just in sequence, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Abdul. Thanks, Pranav and Bold. I'll try to answer wherever I can. So in terms of the financial industries to model related climate risks, I think let's take one step back. I fully agree with you. There are multi-angled climate risks, and then there is no consensus on what modeling will be widely accepted by all. So I think so far this is still the issue. We don't have sufficient disclosure related to climate risks to the financial sector, and then so that also can be one factor why there is no ready modeling. Is because there is no inputs as information. But having said that, I think the financial sector really needs to be ready to price in different type of climate risks. As you just mentioned, there are different types. So I think first of all, the financial sector really needs to understand the possible physical risk assessments. So how their loans and assets might be exposed to physical risk related to climate change. At the same time, they also need to understand to model the transition risk in their portfolios. So how the transition in terms of policy changes, technology advances, and market demand changes will affect their clients, and then the bank's assets. So I think they first need to have some model to access physical and the transition risks, and then based on that, I think they can also do further modelings in terms of climate adjusted credit risk in their loan portfolios, and then also I think many central banks already did this. So stress testing and scenario analysis models, so that they can understand how vulnerable or how risky their loan exposures is to different type of climate scenarios. So all this kind of modelings will be needed, but one precondition to that is there is relatively satisfactory information inputs in terms of climate-related disclosure of their clients. So that is about this modeling. And then in terms of both question, I think it is more on the greenwashing. It's also related to how accurate and how trustworthy the climate risk and climate performance is into this project itself, and then how financial sector can closely monitoring their assets in terms of this climate risks and emission performances. So I will stop here and then hand over back to Abdul. Okay,
thanks very much, Grace. All right, if I move on now to other questions in the Q&A, there's a question from Wesley. And actually, several of these are questions which are best for David to take. So the question from Wesley, a bit unclear to me, maybe David can interpret. There's a question from Bridget on when analyzing the loss of GDP, how is the increase in intensity and frequency of extreme events causing disasters considered? A question from Pranav on CGE models from which these scenarios are generated. And also, are there any empirical models that can be developed and validated historically for their performance? and I think there's, if you don't mind, David, I'll throw, I'm just, because we're already at the hour and I want to make sure we get to everything before 11:15. Manny Jimenez also has a question. Are there areas in Asia that could benefit from global warming? Could growing seasons lengthen in some places? And if so, did your models take this into account? Go ahead, David.
Okay, thanks for the excellent questions. In terms of the frequency of disasters, yes, this is incorporated in the modeling, in that we're looking at losses from flood events, and flood events are coming from a range of general circulation models, and their high resolution outputs, daily rainfall outputs. So the whole variability that comes from those models is reflected. Sea level rise is not just sea level itself, but it's also the associated storm surges and wave action that would happen under general circulation model projections. In agriculture, we're also not just looking at the sort of change in the mean, but we're looking at the change in indices of drought and extreme precipitation going into the future, and we find that as the major cause of losses. So we may not get every disaster event that's expected in the future, but we get some very important channels of disasters. It's not everyone. So for example, things like landslides would not be incorporated, but a number of important channels we do try to reflect. In terms of the benefits of global warming, we also do reflect this in what we do. So first of all, agriculture isn't harmed everywhere. It's harmed in certain locations and for certain crops. And that is because there's something called carbon dioxide fertilization. Plants breathe CO2 just like we breathe oxygen. And when there's more CO2 in the air, they can grow faster. So that is one beneficial effect. It's offset by the fact we have more drought, more flooding, more extreme events. And we find that as the major driver of losses. But in places where those extreme events don't happen as much, and for crops that are less susceptible, systems that are less susceptible, we actually find yield increases. So rice has yield increases in some parts of Asia. There are also other beneficial effects in certain subregions, like less energy consumption for heating, even though there's more energy consumption for cooling, or there can be trade effects. A country less impacted by climate change for a key industry than another can actually get comparative advantage. So they locally can benefit even if the globe is suffering. But taking all this into account, we still see these sort of quite large losses. So we have accounted, we're not biased and only picking up things that are negative, but taking it all together, there's a lot of risk for the region. And then finally, on the question about sort of coastal risk assessment, different countries are doing different things. There are examples of countries that are doing very good coastal risk assessments and incorporating this in adaptation plans. So for example, the Maldives has a lot of very detailed consideration of the risks, coastal risks, including from sea level rise and associated phenomena. Other countries may not have as thorough processes, so it is variable. And it's something that can be strengthened in quite a few countries. And there's a general need to strengthen a lot of planning processes around adaptation and mainstream them into development, into budget planning, and to bring the process upstream and make it more cross-cutting. I hope that addresses all the questions.
Yep,
Thank you.
That was very helpful, David. So it's actually interesting. You actually took Wesley's second question. Let me quickly address Wesley's first question. Oops, it just disappeared. But basically, what Wesley had asked about, given the increase, the impacts with increasing O&M budgets, and I forget what the other item was. Actually, I can look at it. Would that be a good solution? Here, I can see it now. Would increasing project O&M budgets and adhering to best practices and regulatory guidelines be a good solution for tackling the challenges of climate change? I mean, they obviously help, but I think for me, one of the takeaways here is that the changes are, first of all, they're already here and they're increasing rapidly. And we need to do more than just that. One of the things from Toru's opening remarks and Yi's presentation that you can see is the need to not just think about incremental adaptation, but to think about it in a more holistic and systematic way. So it can't be just thinking about, okay, here's a project, we need to increase the O&M. That won't cut it. We need to do a lot more than that, and we need to integrate adaptation planning into national development plans as well. Okay. Aini has a question about agriculture, the current status of agriculture-focused adaptation and mitigation projects. Are there many projects specifically addressing this sector? And that she notes that data provided by ADB is very valuable for prioritizing and targeting sector-specific projects. And thank you, Mila, for flagging one of the projects you're involved in on mitigation. Does anybody in the on the panel want to take Aimi's question? Maybe talk about the adaptation in agriculture, both adaptation and mitigation in agriculture.
Abdul, I can say
Sure.
a few things.
Okay.
So obviously, agriculture is a climate conditioned sector, and so it's very essential to think about adapting to future climate. And there's a big intersection between actually development needs and what we need to do for climate change in agriculture. So within agriculture, if you look at things like, say, genetic improvement of crops, it's been relatively successful. Genetic improvement can work to address drought stress, flood stress, other abiotic stresses that we expect with climate change. It helps us both in current conditions and also helps us to adapt to future conditions. Actually, every time we improve varieties, for example, we are doing it in the context of a changing climate. If we didn't keep improving varieties, actually yields of crops would go down if you keep using the same variety over time. Extension systems, though, have to be strengthened substantially to really address the future challenges that we will face. We're going to have a future that's much more volatile, much more unpredictable, and farmers will need to be equipped with much more knowledge-intensive kinds of technologies that don't go as easily as seed has in the past. So building that requires a lot of attention to the sector and building institutional capacity, not just sort of simple, only the simple kinds of interventions that have worked in the past. When we also look into the future, a lot of water stress is going to be a major issue because evaporation is conditioned by heat. So there will be a lot more water stress, even if rainfall increases. So that again calls for more investment in irrigation, more promotion of water-saving technology. And it's something that a lot of these projects take time. So we need to start thinking about them now. There's massive irrigation infrastructure that will need to be adapted. And then across the whole value chain, we need to prepare for future kinds of risks, like, for example, food storage will become more difficult as temperatures become warmer. Whole value chains will need adaptation to future risks. So it's very important. And this is something that is part and parcel of many ADB operations. ADB focuses very much on value chains, on irrigation using water-saving techniques, and trying to improve extension systems and climate-smart agriculture. So it is critically important. It's something that's sort of interwoven into everything we do to support agriculture in the context of a changing climate.
Great. Thanks very much, David. Mark talked about, said that, there's reduced GDP. Do we have measures on how does climate change impact GDP in critical sectors? Yes, that's there, Mark. I invite everyone to look at the report. The losses are actually built up from losses in individual sectors. So in fact, there are losses to agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and you can find that in the report. So thank you for that question. Okay, let me look at the others. There are questions still coming in. I guess the last one from Wesley is more a comment rather than a question. And Swandi said, knowing that climate is a global and interconnected issue, how does the study cover the outlook of Asian region contributing to GHG emissions and decarbonization efforts. Well, it's moving. In the global scenario, if any, what are the watch outs? Does anybody want to take that? Sorry, before that, I noticed there was another question also on how from Pranav on how climate risk and mitigating policies would be impacted by global political leadership. I noticed that we just have 5 minutes left. Grace, maybe do you want to answer Pranav's question really briefly? And then if anybody wants to take Sawandi's question, let me know. Go ahead, Grace.
Sure, Abdul, very briefly, I think thanks for the question, Pranav. I think global political leadership will definitely have some impacts in terms of climate policy uncertainty, and then also how that will shape the market's response to the transition as investors, as consumers and suppliers. So I think that is all the key aspects that we might need to watch up, and then that will have an impact on the transition pathways. Thanks. Abdul, back to you.
Great, thanks. Oops, I lost my Q&A. Let me try to find the Q&A again. Or again, while I'm finding my Q&A, if any of the panelists just want to take any of the remaining questions, I think we just have a couple. In fact, we may have time for one or two more.
I can offer for Sawandi's question. I would just like to make a plug for another piece of work of ours that actually focuses on decarbonization pathways for developing Asia, and that's in the Asian Development Outlook Thematic Report 2023. We looked in detail at how the region could contribute to achieving global net zero. So I also,
that's right.
If you're interested in sort of the big picture question of transition pathways for Asia, I'd encourage you to take a look at that report. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. And so this inaugural Asia-Pacific climate report, it's not meant to be comprehensive. We envision this to be a recurring publication, and so we expect to get into in much mitigation in greater depth in future reports as well. I think that is, well, there was one question on I think, yeah, I only see one last question on the modeling. David, is that something you can take quickly?
Yes. So I do want to provide one little piece of clarification. So what we're doing is, what we're presented here are what are the effects of losses in the sector on GDP. There also is, I see some people are asking about the question, what is the effect of climate change on the GDP of the sector? And actually the GDP of the sector itself is impacted not only by the losses in that sector, by losses also in other sectors. So if you would like to see the loss in the sector, that's actually reported in a background paper that is linked in the report and should shortly be on the website. So that actually shows from all the other shocks, what is the loss in a particular sector. But we do find that the losses that occur in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, we report how that contributes to the loss of the overall economy in the central report. And we find those losses become quite important by 2070. They're contributing a loss overall of several percent of GDP. And remember, those sectors under rapid economic growth after 2070, those sectors don't comprise a huge share of GDP as economies transform. So there is a large loss of the GDP of those sectors as well. But for the specific details, please look in the paper. Thank you.
Yes, again, I'd encourage everyone to look at the full report. The link has been provided. If you can't find it, email us. We'll send it to you. Or it's also on the main ADB website. It's actually the first item there now. We are at time, and so I'd like to thank all the panelists for their very useful interventions. We did get through all the questions. Before we close today's seminar, I want to invite everyone to join the next Asian Impact webinar, which is on unveiling insights from the Indonesia Longitudinal Survey, which will be held on November 14 from 3 to 4 p.m. Manila time via Zoom. You can see the slide for it now, the advert for it. And again, please do check out the Asian Impact webinar page and the Chief Economist's X account for more updates. Thank you, everyone, for the panelists, to Toru for his opening remarks, and to the audience for very active participation. It was a great discussion. Feel free to reach out to us anytime if you need more information about this. It's a really important topic. We're doing a lot of work on it, both on the knowledge side and in operations, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you, everybody, and hope to see you again soon.